Paris, 1840. Imagine a grand ballroom filled with the scent of expensive perfume and the soft hum of the elite. A girl walks in and the room goes silent. Her skin is as white as fresh snow, her frame impossibly slender, and her cheeks burn with a delicate, ethereal crimson glow. Every eye follows her. Her name is Mary, the most celebrated beauty in the city, but there is a chilling secret behind that glow. To look like Mary, to possess that divine radiance, you didn't need expensive jewelry or royal blood. You needed to be dying. This was the White Death, tuberculosis. Today, we know it as a brutal, lung-shredding infection. But in the 19th century, society didn't see a plague. They saw an aesthetic. The symptoms of this terminal illness, the extreme weight loss, the pale, translucent skin, and the fever-induced flush, aligned perfectly with the Victorian ideal of fragile femininity. While modern medicine sees a body fighting for oxygen, the 1840s saw a heavenly light in the eyes of the afflicted. This wasn't just a trend, it was an obsession. Women from high society salons to damp back alleys were desperate to mimic the look of a failing body. But why? Why would a world ravaged by death decide that the face of a killer was the height of fashion? The answer lies beneath the soot-covered streets of the Industrial Revolution. As the rural world vanished and factories rose, the air itself became a weapon. People were flocking to cities like Paris and London, chasing dreams that would soon turn into a coughing fit of blood. But before the tragedy struck, the disease transformed its victims into living works of art, ghosts of the elite who were admired until their very last breath. While the elite in their gilded salons were busy romanticizing the ghostly glow of the dying, a much darker engine was driving this plague across the globe: the Industrial Revolution. This wasn't just a change in technology, it was a total reconstruction of human life. To truly understand why a fatal infection became a fashion statement, we have to leave the grand balls of Paris and step into the soot-stained reality of families like the Thomases. Imagine the roads leading into major urban centers in the mid-1800s. They were perpetually choked with wagons and weary travelers. These were the dispossessed, farmers fleeing failing crops and rising taxes, lured by the siren song of steady wages in the city. Thomas, a rugged man who had spent his life under the open skies of the North, believed he was securing his children's future when he sold his last livestock to rent a room in the city. He didn't realize he was moving them into a vertical coffin. The room was a shock to the system. On the third floor of a decaying brick tenement, the stairs creaked under the weight of thousands of desperate souls. The windows were narrow slits that barely allowed a gray, filtered light to touch the floor. But for Thomas, discomfort was a price he was willing to pay for a job at the massive textile mill down the street. The rhythm of his new life was mechanical and unforgiving. Every morning, long before the sun broke through the thick urban smog, Thomas joined a silent tide of workers marching toward the factories. These structures were monsters of brick and iron, constantly belching black carbon that stained the sky a bruised, bloody red. Inside the mill, the atmosphere was a physical weight. Hundreds of looms roared in a chaotic, deafening symphony. Gears screamed, belts hissed, and the very floorboards vibrated with a pulse that seemed to rattle the teeth in his head. But the real killer was the snow of the slums. As the morning light hit the factory floor, it revealed a thick, shimmering fog of cotton dust. These microscopic fibers were the silent byproduct of the industrial dream. They hung in the air, coating everything: hair, clothes, skin. And with every labored breath in that sweltering heat, those fibers traveled deep into the lungs, carving out tiny scars. In this airless environment, the cough of one infected worker wasn't just a sound. It was a delivery system for a microscopic executioner. Thomas worked 12 hours a day, convinced that his exhaustion was the foundation of his family's survival. But by the third month, the factory began to take back what it had given. It started with a dry, persistent tickle in his throat. He blamed the dust. He blamed the cold. But soon, the White Death began its systematic harvest of his body. His muscular frame, built by years of farm work, began to collapse. His jawline sharpened into a jagged edge as his fat vanished. His skin, once bronzed by the sun, turned a translucent, haunting white. And then, the final aesthetic marker appeared. 2 bright, feverish red spots on his cheeks. His wife watched in terror, knowing that in their neighborhood, this wasn't a sign of beauty. It was the mark of the grave. One evening, during a simple meal of thin soup, Thomas was seized by a cough that sounded like tearing silk. He pressed a hand to his mouth, and when he pulled it away, his palm was flooded with bright, arterial red blood. The irony was complete. Thomas now possessed the ethereal look that the wealthy were dying to imitate. But for him, there was no poetry, only the chilling realization that he would never climb those creaking stairs again. While the working class was suffocating in the slums, a strange phenomenon was taking hold in the marble halls of high society. To the wealthy, tuberculosis wasn't seen as a consequence of filth, but as a sign of a superior soul. They believed the disease didn't just kill, it enlightened. This was the era of the romantic martyrs, where the brightest minds of the century were seen as burning out like beautiful, tragic candles. Take the young John Keats, one of England's greatest poets. In 1820, at just 25 years old, Keats coughed into a handkerchief and saw a single drop of bright red blood. Having studied medicine, he knew exactly what it meant. He called it his death warrant. But as his body withered, his poetry reached a level of sensitivity that the world had never seen. Society watched him fade and whispered that the disease was consuming his physical form to let his genius shine through. This birthed a dangerous concept known as phthisica. Doctors of the time described it as a state of creative euphoria mixed with profound melancholy. They believed that as the lungs failed, the brain was stimulated into a feverish burst of artistic energy. To the Victorians, being consumptive meant you were too sensitive, too refined, and too beautiful for this cruel industrial world. Then there was Frédéric Chopin. In the candlelit salons of Paris, the world-renowned composer sat at his piano, his fingers long, pale, and trembling. He was so thin he looked like a shadow, his skin translucent under the flickering lights. Every time he coughed, the audience didn't feel horror. They felt a perverse kind of awe. They heard the fragility of his lungs in the haunting, melancholic notes of his nocturnes. To them, Chopin wasn't just a musician. He was the living embodiment of the tuberculosis aesthetic. This romanticization turned a horrific infection into a spiritual gift. Lord Byron, the ultimate celebrity of the age, famously said, "I should like to die of a consumption," because the ladies would all say, "Look at that poor Byron. How interesting he looks in dying." It sounds insane to us now, but at the time, dying of TB was considered the most beautiful death. It was slow, it was quiet, or so the poems claimed, and it allowed the victim to remain pure and ethereal until the very end. Art fueled this delusion. Famous paintings like The Last Glance portrayed young women dying in their beds looking like peaceful angels, with perfectly flushed cheeks and bright, sparkling eyes. There was no mention of the choking on blood, the night sweats, or the agonizing struggle for air. The reality of the disease was being buried under layers of poetry and oil paint. But why were people so eager to embrace this? Because unlike the Black Death or cholera, which were seen as ugly and dirty diseases of the poor, Tuberculosis was clean. It didn't disfigure the face with scars like smallpox. It sharpened the features. It brightened the eyes. It made you look like a tragic hero from a novel. This was the moment the White Death stopped being a medical crisis and became the ultimate status symbol. If you looked like you were dying of consumption, it meant you were wealthy enough to be fragile and brilliant enough to be chosen by the disease. Nature is rarely perfect. Even in the height of the Victorian era, not everyone was lucky enough to contract the disease that would grant them the coveted ethereal glow. But the obsession with the tuberculosis look was so deep that if you weren't dying naturally, you were expected to fake it, even if the methods themselves ended up killing you. In the mid-1850s, the vanity of the elite turned into a chemical warfare against their own bodies. To achieve that translucent, ghostly skin, women began using enamels of the stars, cosmetics loaded with lead, mercury, and even thallium. They would coat their faces in a thick white paste, effectively sealing their pores with poison. But white skin wasn't enough. It needed to look hollow. To achieve the sunken-eyed, exhausted look of a consumptive patient, some women would use belladonna drops in their eyes to dilate their pupils, risking permanent blindness just for a heavenly sparkle. But the most dangerous shortcut to beauty was tucked away in the medicine cabinet. They called it the arsenic complexion wafer. These were literally small biscuits or pills containing arsenic. The idea was simple. Arsenic destroys red blood cells, which prevents tanning and keeps the skin morbidly pale. Users knew it was poison, but they traded their internal organ health for a week of looking like a tragic heroine. They were literally consuming a slow-acting executioner to mimic a disease that was already killing their neighbors. And then there was the silhouette. The Victorian ideal required a body that looked as fragile as glass, a frame that suggested you could snap at any moment. This led to the evolution of the health corset, a devastating irony. These garments weren't made for health. They were made of whalebone and steel, designed to squeeze the waist to an impossible degree. Imagine the physical toll. To achieve the consumptive waist, these corsets were cinched so tight that they physically displaced the internal organs. The liver was pushed downward, the stomach was crushed, and most importantly, the lungs, the very organs tuberculosis attacked, were restricted to less than half their natural capacity. Women fainted not because they were delicate, but because they literally couldn't draw enough oxygen to stay conscious. This chronic oxygen deprivation mimicked the shallow, labored breathing of a TB patient, making the healthy look just as breathless and ethereal as the dying. By the 1860s, fashion had become a mirror of the plague. High collars were designed to hide the swollen lymph nodes in the neck, a common symptom of scrofula, a form of TB. The long, sweeping skirts of the era were perfect for hiding the wasting muscles of the legs. Every stitch of clothing, every drop of eyewash, and every wafer of arsenic was a calculated move to look like a ghost before you actually became one. This was the peak of the delusion. A society terrified of the White Death in the slums was actively manufacturing its symptoms in the ballrooms. It was a cycle of morbid imitation. The poor died in agony from a disease they couldn't escape, while the rich spent fortunes on poison to look like they were sharing that same agony. But the masquerade was about to end. In a small laboratory in Berlin, a man was looking through a microscope, and he was about to prove that there was nothing spiritual or romantic about the killer living in their lungs. The romantic mask didn't just slip, it was obliterated. In March 1882, Robert Koch stood before the Physiological Society in Berlin and revealed the invisible monster, Mycobacterium tuberculosis. For the first time in history, the world saw the truth. Consumption wasn't a spiritual enlightenment or a gift for the chosen elite. It was a germ, a parasite, It thrived in the filth, the darkness, and the breath of the suffering. Almost overnight, the White Death lost its glamour. The heavenly light in the eyes was reclassified as a symptom of a deadly infection. The flushed cheeks were no longer a sign of passion, but a warning of contagion. The Victorian society, once obsessed with looking like ghosts, suddenly became terrified of the living dead. Long, sweeping skirts were shortened because doctors warned they carried bacteria from the streets. Heavy beards were shaved off to improve hygiene. The aesthetic of the fragile angel was replaced by a new, vigorous obsession with sunlight, fresh air, and athletic health. But history has a haunting way of repeating itself. While we look back at the Victorian arsenic eaters with horror, we often fail to see our own reflections. In the 1990s, the heroin chic trend brought the sickly, emaciated look back to the high-fashion runways of the US. Today, in the era of social media, extreme fasting and digital filters continue to push the boundaries of attainable beauty, often at the cost of physical and mental health. The Victorian era taught us a chilling lesson. A society's definition of beauty can become more dangerous than the plague itself. We are still a species that can be convinced to romanticize our own destruction, provided it's wrapped in a beautiful aesthetic. As you scroll through your feed today, ask yourself, are we chasing health, or are we just modern-day Victorians, still dying to be beautiful? The truth is often darker than fiction. If this deep dive into history's most twisted beauty standard shocked you, hit that like button and subscribe for more deconstructions of the past. And I want to hear from you in the comments. What modern-day beauty trend do you think people will look back on with horror in 100 years? Let's discuss below.